All right. My voice is a little better, but it's still not projecting where I usually am. So what I'm saying is that if you're having trouble hearing me, just for today, we may have to move up closer until my voice fully recovers. All right. Cervical muscles that we just had. The muscles of our neck are used to move our head and to our what I call a functional circle of sight. In other words, to cancel out. But we don't really need our cervical muscles to do mechanical work on our body. What I mean by that is it's probably never going to happen where you are in one of those traction devices hanging from your head and your sternocleidomastoids are rotating your whole body about your movement. Makes sense? However, when we lower down a little bit, we start to get to our center of mass. If you remember from 310, now we can have a lot of this or this kind of stuff. So the first difference is when we get into these trunk muscles, that's one reason why there's going to be new rules, because for our head, we didn't need our rotators to do any kind of reverse work below it. Okay. But for our trunk muscles, we do. Our trunk muscles can literally move our trunk. It looks like it's moving and it's not, but it could also do the pelvic girdle rotation stuff, if you guys remember from 310. So the first thing I want to do is remind everybody about trunk motion from the trunk's perspective, trunk muscles from the trunk perspective. And the reason we don't say pelvic girdle rotators, the reason we don't have groups of muscles called pelvic girdle rotators is because those could be different muscles. What I mean by that is, I just taught you the cervical flexors are always going to be the same muscles. Extensors are going to always be the same muscles. However, you remember from 310, I can have anterior and posterior pelvic girdle rotation because of my right hip. I can have anterior posterior because of my left hip. I could have anterior posterior because of both hips. Or if I'm doing a reverse crunch, I could have anterior posterior because of trunk. It could be literally different muscles. So although we can say certain muscles are responsible for pelvic girdle motions, influencing of pelvic girdle rotations, we will never say we have pelvic girdle rotators, because those could be hip and or trunk muscles. Does that make sense? Another way of saying it is that even though we're assessing pelvic girdle conversations, we have to bring everything back to the muscles of the trunk or the hips. That's a layman's way of saying what I'm trying to get you to say. Meaning, gravity is trying to spin the pelvis to the left. Awesome. But what is it trying to do to the trunk? That's what's important, so that I can figure out what trunk muscles I need to influence the pelvic girdle rotation. Does that make sense? So let's do this practice right now. Practice 310. Gravity is trying to spin the pelvis to the left transversely. In doing so, it's trying to spin the trunk to the right. If gravity is trying to spin the trunk to the right, I don't want to use muscles that are trying to spin the trunk to the right. Does that make sense? I don't want right transverse trunk rotation pullers. I need left transverse trunk rotation pullers. I'm going to teach you who those muscles are. I'm going to teach you. Does that make sense? So on the old Moodler, I posted these last night because I was totally responsible and totally remembered on my own to post materials in the notes after I was reminded. I was going to do it this morning. All right, guys, check this out. I'm not even going to get into that. I want to go straight into the heart of the matter. And what I want you to look at, don't worry, I'm going to go back and we're going to start from again, but I just have something on my chest. I want to get it off. Our right and left external obliques. I want to start with that. Because what I want to show you right away to build your confidence is that these obliques that I'm going to show you and teach you have the exact same line of pull as the sternocleidomastoid. That's where the easy stuff ends. But all it is just adding more to the story. We're going to look at how internal obliques are just extensions of the opposite. We're going to get into the concept, but just to let you know, the sternocleidomastoids and the external obliques have the same line of pull. The erector spinae of your trunk has the same line of pull. At the trunk, at the neck. So even though there's new stuff, there's some things that are going to be super similar. All right. Let's start with some practical stuff. These are all the muscles you're going to be accountable for. And cutting straight to the chase, I give you their function. So if you learn it based off of every individual muscle, great. If you learn it by listings, great. Make your list. That's what you're accountable for. No different. What is this cross section that we speak of? Well, every joint in our body is somewhat circular. Right? So the neck, this was our cervical circle, anterior, posterior, right, left. And all I'm doing is just making my circle a little bigger. But it's the same concept. My bilateral axis, my trunk flexors are going to be anterior to my spine. My trunk extensors are going to be posterior to my spine. My right lateral benders are going to be on the right side of my belly button, pulling my right shoulder to my right hip. Instead of right ear to right shoulder, we're going right shoulder to right hip. We're just literally just dropping it down. Left side, left shoulder, left hip. Or left hip, left shoulder. Still the same change. And then transversely, same rules. Right transverse trunk rotators, left transverse trunk rotators. Just like the circle. Just we got more stuff. Makes sense. You don't have a lot of mass to move up here. You got a lot more stuff to move here. It's gonna take some more helpers, some more muscle. Let's also remind ourselves what we're working towards. I want my students to come out of this class truly understanding what's happening with the core. It's tricky. But I want my students to be able to specifically say, I know I'm working a right external oblique with a left internal oblique. Or a left external with a right internal, with a left erector spinae. We need to be beyond just saying core, because there's going to be certain rehab exercises or conditions where there's going to be certain exercises that are contraindicated for certain obliques. And we need to know whether an exercise we're doing is targeting or not targeting certain muscles that might be getting in the way. So contraindicated is, right? So it makes sense why people would just say core, because figuring this stuff out isn't easy. But we will be able to do it. And we'll be able to know exactly which muscles we're working through which exercises, okay? Different contractions. All right, this is my favorite part. So the cervical is kind of like a small town. I think I used the class analogy. Who went to a big school? You know, big school and small schools, and the trunk. And I'm not saying it's a big school, but it's busy. There's a lot of stuff happening here because in addition to influencing joint motions, you got to protect some vital organs. So it's not just about motion; it's also about defense and protection. We got a lot of stuff happening in here. And when you have busy, if it's a small town, a four-way stop could work, but if there's too much traffic, a four-way stop isn't going to be efficient at flowing traffic. Big long lines waiting, so you might start to do roundabouts, so you might start doing overpasses to try to help with all the traffic. It's kind of what this is. When we look at layers of these muscles, so you get more superficial and more deep, it's because there's so much action happening, and all of those interactions can't take place in the same place. That's why you have to have an overpass, so that cars can go over the top while other cars go underneath. Because if they met in the same place, you'd have a lot of collisions. So layer-wise, we have our most superficial, okay, so our rectus abdominis that we're going to learn about. I think that makes sense if you see models or you see those tendinous inscriptions of the rectus. That's because it's the most superficial. It's the one that's closest to the skin. That makes sense. Okay. Then underneath that, so it's like, again, it's like layers. Underneath that, because these two different muscles can't occupy the same space. It makes sense. There has to be depth. Then we have our external obliques, the next layer. Then we go further down and more deep, and we have our internal obliques. This is what I was trying to do. Exactly. Put internal obliques in the chat. I don't even know what that means. And then finally, we have the deepest part is our transverse abdominis, and that's one of my favorite things to do is teach you what that does and how that works and why it's there. So does that make sense? We got a lot of stuff happening. This is literally the intersection of our center of mass. This is what translates lower extremity stuff to upper extremity stuff. It's happening in here. It's a big city. So we're going to have layers to our interstates and our road systems. That's going to be more superficial. Muscles only pull, and their function is based off of specific motions that they pull in the direction of. Right? So without even me telling you, you can just look at how these fibers of the rectus abdominis very straight, very up and down. So it makes sense that they're going to be sagittal pullers. Right? And you get into these obliques that now have X and Y. Be like sternocleidomastoid kind of pull. This is another illustration of what I'm talking about with the depth, where you can extract out pieces and see deeper into the layering structure. Because again, all of those different fiber pulls can't be crisscrossing in the same place and space. They can't occupy the same space, so we gotta separate them with depth. Does that make sense? And if you think about protection, it's cool too, because again, you have a lot of different insulation layers to protect your body. All right, now let's get into, before I get into function, let's get into this, what we call tendinous inscriptions. All right, so all that white inner tendon part that you see. So has anybody ever seen vacuum sealed meats, where they'll take meat and they'll vacuum seal it up? Okay, so it's very similar how your body, through, know what fascia is, right? Myofascial. Fascia is just like shrink wrap, and your muscles are like the meat that it gets shrink wrapped, just like you'd be shrink wrapping steaks or something. Okay. What's really cool about those tendinous inscriptions in the fascia is because you're going to have certain muscles on one side of your trunk working directly with separate muscles on the other side, but in the same direction of pull. It makes sense that you need you need a way to transfer the force from one side to the other side, like almost like passing the baton. So, in other words, if I have, I'm just going to give you this practically, but if I have a muscle on my right side that's trying to twist me to the left, working with another muscle on my left side that's also trying to twist me to the left, two separate muscles, it makes sense that we need to kind of have some type of connective tissue that can transfer this contracting force with that contracting force and make them work together. Does that make sense? And that can be transversely or frontally or sagittally. So when you see all this white tendinous inscription, it's just literally like a mesh where different muscles can compartmentalize to help transfer their force over when they're working with other muscles. Has anybody ever seen those finger webbing exercises machines? It's like just a webbing and you can kind of grab it. So it's like having this web, and it doesn't matter if you pull on this side or that side, top, bottom, however you pull, the web can kind of help transfer forces across, up, down, side to side. That makes sense? Kind of cool. So that's what all that's about. It's to help transfer forces in different directions. All right. First thing I'm going to talk about is the transverse abdominis. I want you to look at your listings of the muscles that I gave you and tell me if there's a group that the transverse abdominis belongs to, based off of what I gave you. No. Okay. The transverse abdominis is a skeletal muscle that goes from one side of your vertebra, wraps, that's very deep, wraps around your abdomen and inserts on the other side of your vertebra. So in other words, it's like pulling on the same place. When we get into like external and internal obliques and stuff, you're going to notice they go from like pelvis to ribs. But this one starts on one end of the vertebra, goes around and inserts on the other end of the vertebra. So in other words, it's creating, it's your body's largest sphincter muscle. It's there to help create interthecal pressure, if you think about it. Like it's meant to be a circle, and it's meant to contract to create pressure, to help create rigid links. Think about if you take a tube of toothpaste and you squeeze in the middle, the pressure goes at the top and the bottom, right? It's the same thing. When you contract your transverse abdominis, it's squeezing your tube of toothpaste and force goes top and bottom. Does that make sense? Protection of our organs? Absolutely. Helping to create interthecal pressure when we need a push? Absolutely. But creating specific joint motions? No, because it ends in the same place that it begins. Not literally, but my point is that if it's going from one vertebra to the other vertebra, it can't independently do this or this, because as it does this, it's pulling the other side the other way. Now, this muscle, for some of you that are going to be doing rehab, is very important to like lumbar stabilization stuff, which makes sense. If it's going vertebra to vertebra, it's going to be very important to try to maintain stability of the vertebra that it does pull on. But in terms of specific independent joint motions, that's not its job. It's basically a huge skeletal sphincter muscle that helps us create interthecal pressure in our abdomen. Okay? All right. All right. Let's start off with going external. I like to start with external because we have the precedent of our sternocleidomastoid. All right. For your unit 1, we had 2 separate sternocleidos. You had your right and your left. Same thing here. We have a right and a left external oblique. So if you say external obliques, plural, that's another way of inferring right and left. Okay. But if we say obliques, well, gosh, does that mean externals and internals? So we have to be very careful of playing fast and loose with these terms. Okay. So right and left, external oblique, totally independent of each other, 2 separately innervating muscles. I'm going to teach you the rectus abdominis. That one strip is 2 separate strips. You know, the right side is totally separately innervated than the left side. Okay? So it's the same thing here. They cross anterior to the spine. So I think the obvious function is going to be the trunk flexion function. Does that make sense? Trying to bring the front of the ribs to the pelvis. This view, remember, 2-dimensional pictures limit our 3-dimensional view of these concepts. So the frontal plane pull might be hard for certain people to see. The frontal plane pull would be, hey, right ribs, come closer to right hip. So in other words, there's my anterior pull of the flexion, but the downward pull would be the frontal view in terms of a right lateral trunk bender. So if you're doing side crunches, right? Does that make sense? However, a front view would be a lot better for, there we go, an anterior view would be a lot better to see the frontal plane pulls. Right? But this view right here, it'd be a lot harder to see other dimensions pulls. That's why we want to look at things in different views to see all the different pulls, and then we summarize all that into our circles as the so what. Our circles give us a 3-dimension, 1 dimension for all the different pulls that a 2-dimensional picture struggles with. So this view right here, it'd be very tough to see the anterior pull because we don't have depth, we don't have 3D glasses. Does that make sense? So this view gives us the frontal plane pretty good. Right external is a right lateral, left external is a left lateral. The frontal view, or the bilateral axial view, gives us a much better view of the flexion pull. And in my opinion, this also gives us the best, this gives us an idea, this gives us the best view of the transverse, but it really takes a 3-dimensional view. That's why I like having the skeletons to try to show you 3-dimensionally the transverse. All right, so here's what's happening, guys. And remember, I'm not going to ask you to memorize which specific ribs and which linear aspera, and just look at how it's pulling. That's all it is. Just practically speaking, you have the muscle going from the pelvis area, reaching out to the ribs and saying, and pulling this way, okay? So watch this, how cool. My fingers are kind of representing the line of pull of the muscles. All right? The frontal view is kind of easy. The flexion view is kind of easy. This is the one I'm trying to show you. Right sternocleidomastoid, right external oblique. So when these muscles are pulling transversely, they're trying to draw posterior portions of the ribs and make them come anterior. Meaning they're doing like this. Does that make sense? So a right external oblique is a left transverse trunk rotation pull in the transverse plane. Does that make sense? It's really hard to see, but that's because this is a 2-dimensional image. It's hard to see that 3rd dimension. So if we had 3D glasses, you would notice that this part is more closer to you than that part, which is more in the back. This is not going straight up. And because it has depth, when it's pulling transversely, it's trying to twist this way. Does that make sense? For the cervical, I used a silly term like the right sternocleidomastoid. It's like pulling the right ear forward, right? So all we got to do is just try to find an analogy working down where the right external oblique is trying to pull the right shoulder forward. Not literally, but just as an analogy, that it's like something pulling forward on my right side is trying to twist me to the left. Something pulling forward on my left side would be trying to twist me to the right. It's the same concept. Make sense? All right, check this out. Dr. George, every now and then I like to toss in some analogies from Dr. George that I remember from, good Lord, 30 years ago. Dr. George used to use this analogy where he said, how many of you heard the Old West and gunfighters? And he used this analogy where he said, he used the gun and holster analogy, the Wild West, the little kid stuff. And he said, your external oblique would be like a holster, and the internal oblique would be like the pistol that the cowboy puts in the holster, where it's inside, but it runs crisscross to the actual sheath. So in other words, if your holster opens like this, the pistol would go inside of it like that. You see how they would crisscross? Okay. So what I mean by that is, if this was the holster for the cowboy's pistol, the gun that would go in would be an internal oblique. Notice in this analogy, I'm going to show you the internal, but it's important to see how the angle, the transverse angle, is in a different line of pull than the external. They have similar sagittal pull, and they have similar frontal pull. But instead of going posterior to anterior, the internal oblique is running anterior to posterior. Does that make sense? It would literally, if there was, we don't need it, but if we had a sternocleidomastoid like this, it would literally be if there was some muscle in the front that ran like that. Like pulling in the opposite direction transverse. So, what does that mean? That means that is this a right or a left? It's a left, facing this way. So that means the left internal oblique is trying to pull in a direction of left transverse. Because it's trying to take the ribs in the front and pull them to the posterior pelvis. I promise I have some tricks to try to make all this make sense. And my first trick is, who knows who Chewbacca is from Star Wars? So you know how Chewbacca is known for his belt, right? Chewbacca had, I still don't know what it held, some Scooby snacks or something, I don't know. But Chewbacca has this belt, right? And the Chewbacca belt doesn't go like a satchel, it goes across. Okay? So what I'm trying to get you to see, we're going to see it, is that if I had something that goes all the way across, transversely, it's pulling in the same direction. In other words, all of this belt is pulling in the direction of left transverse. All I'm trying to get you to see is that this belt, this across belt, the part on the right is going to be represented by my right external, and the part of my left is going to be represented by my left internal, meaning they have the exact same line of pull transversely. The internal of the opposite side external completes the crisscross belt. And the right external gets its force transferred to the left internal and vice versa through these tendinous inscriptions that exist, that live in between all those shrink wrap packs of muscles. So the right external and the left internal are left transverse trunk rotators because they pull in the same direction transversely. And thus, the left external and the right internal are going to be right transverse trunk rotators because they have the same direction of pull transversely. What's also cool is same-sided obliques cancel out transversely. So if you were doing side crunches, your left external and your right internal cancel out transverse, and they can just work together in the frontal. If you were doing crunches, all of your externals and internals can cancel out. You can work together in the sagittal. But when you start to pull across, you need specific external to work with specific internal that have the same line of pull. That make sense? Because you need to cancel out here and work together here or here. So let's see what that would look like on our practical circles. Right external oblique has the same transverse pull as the left internal. In other words, both of those muscles are trying to spin the merry-go-round the same direction. Does that make sense? Left external, right internal are trying to spin the merry-go-round in the other direction. All of them are trying to pull in the direction of trunk flexion. Only the ones on the right side of the belly button are right lateral pullers, and only the ones on the left side of the belly button are left lateral pullers. But when it comes to obliquity, transverse pull, we have to use a specific external with a specific internal that are ipsilateral, that are on opposite sides. Completes the Chewbacca belt. Make sense? We don't have a skeletal muscle that crosses the midline, diaphragm and heart. But so we have to have structures in place to carry over that force to the other side. And that's what the white stuff does in our app. It's tendinous inscriptions. Let's go back to our first question of the day, guys. I want you in small groups or by yourself, that's fine. I want us to be able to use our tools from 310 to identify isometric, okay? No motion, we're going to keep it simple. I want you to use your 310 tools to identify a specific group of muscles that I need at the trunk to maintain this position. And then, just for this example, tell me which specific obliques. That's it. Is it right external or left external? Is it right internal or left internal? Does that make sense? Because this is the hard part. So I want to introduce it to you now. And then we'll keep, obviously we're going to finish the muscles, but the other muscles are easy. This is the hard stuff. All right, go. I'm gonna give you the long way to get to the answer, and I'm gonna give you a shortcut on how to get to the answer. I don't care which one you use, I just want you to get to the right answer. Okay. Here's the long way. Gravity's trying to spin the pelvis to the left, but in doing so, it's trying to spin the trunk to the right. It's trying to spin the trunk to the right. I don't need right transverse trunk rotators. I need left transverse trunk rotators. That's hard for us to see because it's not. It looks like it's that cap and bottle stuff. But we have to understand the logic. If gravity is trying to twist that person's trunk to the right, you wouldn't need muscles. That's like saying if gravity is trying to extend your elbow, you wouldn't need extensors. It's the same thing. Good? So I know I need left transverse trunk rotators. I know it. Because the same muscles that are trying to pull your trunk, it looks like it's moving, and it is trying to do this. That's what's happening here. Okay. Here's the shortcut. If I had a rope that I was going to lasso that person's legs and pull to try to prevent that from happening, I would have the exact line of pull that I have from the right external oblique and the left internal. Does that make sense? I would need oblique muscles that have this line of pull because I'm literally anchoring here and trying to take this pelvis and pull it this way. So which obliques run like this? Right external. I like to keep it in terms of muscles influence motion to contraction. I like to keep it that way. But sometimes just literally having a so what helps to see what I'm talking about. So in other words, the same muscles that are trying to pull the pelvis to the right are also trying to spin the trunk to the left. The reason the trunk doesn't move is because you got your hands there, anchoring you down, keeping you down. Does that make sense? Let me try it another way. Let's see. The same muscles. I did it this time. All right. The same muscles that are pulling this way are also pulling this way. Take your swivel chair and spin your hips to your right. So have right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. You used your left transverse trunk rotators to make that happen. Because the same muscles that want to do this also want to do this, because you get to the same place. Does that make sense? Whether they anchor here and move here, or anchor up here and pull the bottom part across, they're still trying to pull either this side of that or this side of this. That makes sense? So, right external, left internal. Any questions or clarifications of how we got to that? All right, how about this? They have one of these at Bourgeois. In the weight room. All right, guys, let's use some clues. When you get into a machine, all the weight stacks, are all the plates are touching. Makes sense? You get in the machine and your first movement splits the stacks. That's the actual work, right? So based off of these weight stacks, I know that this is your start position. In other words, this is the way the machine was positioned to get in, and then his first movement is going to be here. So I know this was the concentric, because you got to make it happen. Gravity would be trying to take you back to here. Does everybody understand? Okay. I would love for us, by the end of the day, to be able to answer beyond core. I would love for us to be able to say, I can figure out which external and which internal have to work together to make that transverse motion happen. Okay? So remember, we can talk about pelvic girdle rotations. I have no problem with that. Left transverse pelvic girdle rotation, right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. But when it comes to muscles, remember, the basketball has to have something to spin it. When it comes to muscles, we have to bring it back to trunk or hips. Because we can't say pelvic girdle rotators, because it could have been hip muscles, it could have been trunk muscles. Obviously, this isn't hip stuff, right? So it's the muscles of the trunk. So that's your goal, to be able to identify which external and which internal when I go from start to finish. Go. Feel free to utilize your swivel chair. Even though there's no external force on it, it might help you see the motion that the exercise is trying to do to your trunk. And I just realized I didn't turn the camera back on. Okay, so here's the example. We know this is the start position because all the plates are together. And we know this is the finish because the plates are separated. So let's try to figure out the obliques, which internal and external from start to finish. All right, just a hint. Remember, if there's no external force when you start, like in other words, right when you get a new machine, the machine may not be trying to do it. If that's NA, not applicable, meaning the external force isn't trying to do anything to me right in the front, then start with motion. Because once you have motion, then the external force is now, it's obvious what it's trying to do to you. So if there's no external force at the start of the exercise, start with motion and then say, okay, well, while I was doing this motion, what was the machine trying to do to me? Does that make sense? All right. From right to left, he does left transverse pelvic girdle rotation. But the motion at the trunk is right transverse trunk motion, right? During that motion, the machine's trying to take him back. So in other words, the machine is trying to spin his trunk to the left. Let me say that again. In this position, his trunk is twisted to his left. Do we agree? His sternum is looking at his left hip. So while he does this motion, the machine is trying to bring him back to where he started. Make sense? The machine is trying to twist his trunk to its left. If the machine is trying to twist his trunk to his left, the last thing he needs are muscles that are trying to twist his trunk to his left. He doesn't need left transverse trunk rotators. He has to use right transverse trunk. Left external, right internal. Now, these muscles can pull this way, but that machine isn't letting the top part move above the bottom. So if I can't move the top to my bottom, my only other option is to move the bottom to the top. Same muscle. Make sense? Concentrics, eccentrics, we'll do more of those. Questions? Clarifications? Guys, this, I'll give you one more, but it's not going to be hard. I don't know what else to call it. This is going to be easy. This is going to be easy, you know? Left external, right internal. I want to practice the harder ones because the easy ones are going to be easy. It looks like it's moving and it is. It's just the muscles that run this way are trying to pull my left shoulder to my right hip or trying to pull my right hip to my left shoulder. That make sense? All right, guys, you're going to have a safe break. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.